It's a great pleasure to be invited and speak to this distinguished group. Actually, I'm not a student of Japan and China-Japan relations. I just happen to wear the hats. You know, the relationship between China and Japan has been very topical, and I've been following too, just like everybody else. So I'll begin with my impressions on the state of China-Japan relations at the moment. And then I'll talk about the reasons for uncertainty and potential conflicts. And finally, I'll talk about my speculations on the future development. I think the current state of China-Japan relationship may be characterized as a mutually harmful relationship as opposed to mutually beneficial relationship. This we can see in the confrontational maneuvering in the neighboring waters of the Diaoyu, or in Japanese, Senkaku Islands. The patrol ships and from China and Japan, they somewhat jostle each other. And also fighter planes once were in the neighboring areas, giving people the impression that they were heading for a conflict. For a time, even the Americans were worried. They put pressure on Japan and China to calm down. In addition to this, we also saw diplomatic, critical verbiage coming from senior ambassadors all over the world, from both countries, condemning each other in media. In a way, if you look back, appear to be rather childish. They were not even diplomatic language. And also the competition, fierce competition, and also vicious competition over high-speed rail projects. I was in Japan last October to give a talk. And one of the people in the audience asked me a question. He said, how do you feel that China is successful in obtaining the project, or in securing the project in Indonesia? Japan lost, China won. I said, come on, you're kidding. I said, Japan lost, that's for sure. China also lost, that's also for sure. Only Indonesian government won. The deal China got was so poor that Chinese have to pray that will not lose money. So I said probably it's better for China and Japan to form a joint venture and sell our products, at least for a profit, however small that profit may be. It became quite irrational, the competition. I don't know how much the Japanese company can benefit from the recent project they won in India. Probably not much if they will win, they will get any profits out of it. The competition was no longer a competition for economic reasons. It became a political competition for moral high ground or some kind of for some kind of psychological satisfaction. And the history issue is still there. Abe went to the Yasukuni Shrine, which led to the suspension of relations, high-level relationship for a while. Why did he go there? The Chinese say that he wanted to rewrite history. The Japanese are saying that no, that's not the case. What is the real reason? I think over time you began to get the impression that history issue is no longer history issue anymore. It's not about history. It's about moral high ground and self-righteousness. So all these issues are there, making the relationship quite damaging to each other. The trade between the two countries is to some extent hurt. And people's impression of the other country has remained extremely low, extremely negative. And this is bad for both countries. At the moment, it is relatively stable since Xi-Abe meeting. Both sides have carefully avoided confrontation in the waters and air space near the Diaoyu Island. China has reduced the number of patrols, patrol ships, and Japan has not. Japanese patrol ships have not been very aggressive in or active in stopping the Chinese patrol ships. So both sides try to avoid the conflict, a physical collision there. Exchanges between the two countries have slowly and hesitantly resumed following the Xi-Abe meetings. The atmosphere of the second meeting, it is said, was much better than the first one, where the photo of which was shown in the newspaper and internet everywhere. But even the meeting of the first one was not as bad as the photo gave people the impression. Diplomatic exchanges over crisis management have been held, even though not much has come out of it. Chinese tourists visit Japan with increasing enthusiasm. Millions of them. And Japan has become one of the most attractive tourist sites for Chinese tourists. And Japan has not only benefited from receiving the tourists in terms of sightseeing and restaurants, hotels, but also these Chinese tourists have been buying everything in Japan, including toilet seats. So maybe a plus for Japan in terms of getting a good trade balance. President Xi stressed the need to promote friendship between the people of the two countries to a large group of Japanese visitors last year. These are positive news. Okay. But then troubles remain. As I said earlier, public survey shows that the views of people in both countries of each other have remained at the bottom. Only over 90% of the people in both countries view the other country negatively. The vicious competition over the high-speed rail projects continues. I don't know what kind of price they're ready to pay. But of course, for those countries which want to build high-speed rail, they have probably the best opportunity now. If they want to build a railway, especially high-speed rail, okay, here are two competitors who are ready to cut each other's throats to sell you the projects. And the history issue is simmering to flare up again. Yeah, Prime Minister Abe probably will not go to the Yasukuni Shrine again soon, unless something big happens in China-Japan relations. But people in Japan are talking increasingly loudly about how China distorts history. And criticizing China for politically using history to dwarf Japan. And the Chinese are very sensitive to such kind of criticisms because they have suspected that the Japanese, at the bottom of their hearts, are, do not believe that they did something wrong during the Second World War. And if they believe that what they did was right, they may do it again. Okay. So both sides, in both sides, there are good reasons to raise the history issue again. And the US is encouraging Japan to send warships to the South China Sea to defend the principle of freedom of navigation. the U.S., I mean, many people in the U.S. believe that the current measures to pressure China are not enough. So they want to put new measures on China, new pressures on China to dissuade China from being more proactive in the South China Sea. And one of the things that they can come up with is to ask Japan and other allies to send warships to the South China Sea to make to make a statement. This can be potentially explosive in China-Japan relationship because well, it can easily raise this historical memory issue, and the popular pressures in China on the military to do something will be high. And I don't know, maybe this would lead to a military conflict if it's not handled well. And also Japan may take more proactive stance on Taiwan with the DPP coming into office. If the relationship between China and Japan get into some kind of trouble, some kind of a serious problem, this is a way to that the Japanese can hurt China. At least it's believed by some Japanese. And the Taiwan issue has been a sensitive issue in China. If Japanese government does this, this probably would raise a serious problem in China-Japan relations also. And also, on the Chinese side, the Chinese patrol of the waters near the Diaoyu Island or Senkaku Island may also increase because of all kinds of reasons. Maybe the people who are in charge of the fishery or maritime affairs may think that this is a way, this may be a politically correct way to do. Now China has built more modern and bigger patrol ships. All these things can touch up, come up to affect the relationship between the two countries in a negative way. You know, what are the reasons behind the uncertainty and tension between the two countries? One, I think, is domestic political pressure in both countries. In Japan, the Japanese government faced the political pressure to not to yield to China's allegedly bully. And on the Chinese side, the Chinese government faces the internal pressures for not to make a compromise to the Japanese historical revisionism, and also continue occupation of China's island. So the domestic political pressures are there, and and very difficult to, very unlikely to go away soon. Also, the leaders of both countries have their own agendas. President Xi probably needs to galvanize authority in his way to push for reforms in China. More recently, he just carried through this military organization, which is a big project, unimaginable a few years ago. Okay. And he has many other reforms in mind. Okay. He needs the authority to do it. Okay. And he doesn't want to be accused of being soft on Japanese revisionism. Okay. And Abe, the Prime Minister, also has his own agenda. He wants to build Japan into a normal state. A normal state with a normal military, especially. And in order to push for his agenda, he cannot compromise, or he doesn't feel comfortable to compromise to China. Probably he also needs a little bit tension in China-Japan relationship, so as to push for his normal state agenda. So neither side feels comfortable to show weakness at this point, because of their own respective agendas. Also the international pressures I just mentioned, the US, especially on the South China Sea, may also make China-Japan relationship difficult, more difficult, okay, if Japan decides to send a patrol ship or warship to the South China Sea. So what about the future prospects? I think in the because of these reasons, in the short run, China-Japan relationship are likely to remain troublesome or problematic. History issue, territorial disputes, mutual suspicions will be there. And the two countries have to carefully manage these issues if they want to have a stable, if not friendly, relationship. In the long run, however, I'm more optimistic. I think one has good reasons to be optimistic about the relationship in the long run. You know, our economies are very interdependent. Japan is unlikely to change its pacifist policy despite the strife to become a normal state. I think Japanese have learned their lessons in history. China also will become more developed, richer, stronger, and therefore share more things in common with Japan in the days to come. If the current trend continues. All this is conducive to a better relationship between China and Japan in the long run. I think the current quite irrational competition will come to an end sooner or later. let me end with this rather optimistic note. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the Institute for inviting me to this distinguished group of scholars. This is actually my first visit to this institute in recent years. It's a great opportunity for me to share my thoughts with you. We had just heard from Mr. Jia about how China looks at the Japanese-Chinese relations. Each point, I would like to say something about it. But instead of going through the points that he has made, I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss more. Since I have prepared the preliminary text, I'd like to go this through first and then have more discussions with Professor Jia. Today, political relations, as he has suggested, relations between Japan and China are in a very difficult stages. Although economic and cultural relations are generally speaking good, two countries are critical of each other's political matters and foreign policy matters, and the public perception and each other are more negative than positive. Yet we have a huge number of Chinese tourists visiting Japan. In 2014, about 3 million Chinese tourists came to Japan, and then last year, about 7 million Chinese tourists visited Japan. You see the Chinese tourists all over Japan who are big eaters in restaurants and also big buyers in department stores and the shops. This helps the Japanese economy, but also that creates some kind of a traffic jam in Tokyo or Ginza area. It's a very strange picture. On the one hand, we have political tensions, but on the other hand, you have a huge number of tourists flocking to major department stores. They buy the duty-free things. The department stores also arranged the special corners for Chinese tourists. They hire, of course, Chinese-speaking attendants and so forth. So in that sense, if you look at that, you see a great, good relationship between the two countries. So there's this gap. How do we explain this gap between political tensions and non-political relaxations? I'd like to point out about five things to talk about the relations which are mutually opposing geopolitical interests. First point is China, in our view, wants to expand its maritime area of influence. As its naval power grows stronger, while Japan wants to protect its maritime interests, namely the safety of long sea lane from Japanese archipelagos down to Taiwan, the Philippines, to the South China Seas, and to the Strait of Malacca. So the East Asian area and Southeast Asia particularly is very important for us. This long sea lane is a lifeline for Japanese economy and Japan's core national interests. More than 85% of Japanese oil imports come from the Middle East. Since a large earthquake crashed several nuclear power plants in 2011, only one plant today is working. Japanese dependency on oil imports, therefore, our sources of energy have increased. When China claims that the South and East China Seas are its core national interests, we claim that sea lane that goes through South China Sea is also our core national interest. Japan is not planning to play any combat role in South China Seas. We are interested in increasing or expanding our non-combat military role in the area. That means be engaged in more surveillance activities or in helping the Southeast Asian countries, particularly Philippines, Vietnamese, and some Indonesians, for capacity building for the strengthen their own forces. Chinese control of South China Sea really threatens the safety of this sea lane because it increases its naval and activities in the area. Japan would like to keep the East and South China Sea issue open, free, and peaceful. Second point is about the relations with the United States. Japan sees the alliance with the United States as vitally important to its national security, whereas China wants to drive a wedge between Japan and the United States. President Xi Jinping proposed in 2013 to President Obama that they divide the Pacific Ocean into two parts. And the United States controls the eastern half, while China controls the western half. If that should happen, there will be no U.S. forces stationed in Japan or in the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese alliance, U.S. alliance, Japanese-Korean alliance, Korean-U.S. alliance will become much weaker. That would affect our security seriously. President Xi Jinping also mentioned at KICA, it's a conference on interaction and confidence building measures in Asia. It's a conference in May 2014 that Asian security should be discussed among Asians themselves. Now this means Asian Americans should stay out of Asia or express in half of the Pacific. This again would weaken the alliance between Tokyo and Washington, also affect the balance of power in the Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific. China's political and security strategy is to catch up with the United States and perhaps eventually seek a global hegemony. There are already many signs of China seeking such a goal. AIIB, One Belt, One Road idea, as well as huge investments in Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, growing interest in Arctic seas, and space developments, to raise just a few examples. China is becoming economically very successful, although it's currently domestic economic growth is facing some difficulties, but China as on the whole is growing. And it's natural that China plays a large economic role around the world. But then the question is, what is China going to accomplish? What's their goal in the future? Japan has opposite interests. We need a strong United States, which has a capacity to lead a global economy with advanced technology, and to take a strong leadership in bringing about global security and political stability. Prime Minister Abe today is willing to support such leadership by Washington. Third point is about the Senkaku. Japan and China have a strong disagreements over the Senkaku or Diaoyu. Japanese government takes a firm stand that Japanese ownership of the island is historically so clearly established that there is no room for dispute by China. Japan owned the island back in 1895, and since then, China had never disputed Japanese ownership until 1971. When a UN report mentioned that Senkaku Islands and their vicinity were potentially rich with oil resources. Of course, China has a different arguments to make. So this is, if you start to talk, it'll be endless arguments between two countries. The Chinese government played up its claim to the islands. The islands became a symbol of Chinese nationalism. The Senkaku Islands are a symbol of also historical differences. But today, has become more than that. Today, it has a strategic significance. By taking the Senkaku Islands, China would gain a better position to exert influence over the southwest archipelagos that stretch south of Kyushu, so that the Chinese naval ships have better access to the Pacific Ocean. The archipelagos include Okinawa, which has large US bases. Some Chinese have started to claim that Okinawa, too, should belong to China. We thought this is a very strange argument, but does appear in the Global Times or People's Daily in China. Fourth, about the rivalry. The two powers are rivals. China does not want to see a strong and influential Japan. We often wonder what is really the reason behind Chinese argument, but the Chinese feels they should maintain the moral high ground over Japan because of the war conduct that Japan committed during World War II. But that situation that happened 70 years ago is still being discussed in China, and they're being used politically to, in our words, to downgrade Japan in international society. As I said, China does not want to see a strong and influential Japan. It has persistently opposed Japan's aspiration, for example, for permanent member status in the UN Security Council on moral ground. Japanese are seriously concerned about China's fast-growing naval and air power. China has talked about itself making a peaceful rise. However, on September 3rd last year, when China displayed many new weapons on the military parade, Japanese wondered, is this the result of the peaceful rise of China? China's increasing military power plus its actions in East and South China Seas, which are power-based and not really lure-based, are changing the balance of power in the Western Pacific. Japan and the United States are economic partners, but at times rivals, but close political and security partners as well. On the other hand, Japan and China are economic partners and at times rivals, but distinctly political rivals. In fact, China has a strategy to downgrade in international society. Last point, China often uses its perception of World War II history in order to keep Japan down. Now, I think this is a real serious issue for us, because this is not the case that we see from, about, for example, the relations between between China and other countries. Only Japanese-Chinese relations, China uses this tactics or strategy to downgrade Japan. President Yasukuni pushed the idea of promoting a nationalism, and in his views, to educate nationalism for Chinese people is to arouse and educate people for anti-Japanese sentiment. That has been the important. Anti-Japanese education has been an important part of education of nationalism in China. Japanese wartime conduct is a convenient means to criticize Japan morally and keep Japanese down. anti-Japanese demonstrations flared in China of the Senkaku Islands, Japanese school textbooks on history, and Prime Minister visiting the Yasukuni. I just want to take a moment to mention a little bit about the Yasukuni. For those people who are not familiar with the Yasukuni Shrine, that was built way back in 1870s or 80s to pay tribute to those who were dead. Now we have had long history, and after 1945, there were lots of Japanese soldiers who died in the war were enshrined. So there are about 3 million Japanese war dead are enshrined in that. But that also includes the 7 A-class war criminals in the Tokyo Tribunal. This came along with a very complicated process, which I can't really describe this in a very short term, so I will not mention that. But these names are there. Therefore, when the Prime Minister goes to visit the Yasukuni Shrine, it's been criticized by countries like Korea and China for Japan going back to wartime fascism or militarization of Japan. But that's not really the case, because today, very few people really know that there were 7 war criminals enshrined there. In fact, on August 15th, day of Japan's surrender, you see 1,000 of Japanese, young and older, visiting Yasukuni Shrine to pay respect for those who were dead. So this is a quite different picture from how our neighbors describe about Prime Minister visiting Yasukuni and actual the situation that is happening in the Yasukuni Shrine. I should also like to say one more thing about the Japanese-Chinese relations in this area. For example, China has built a huge museum that records the Japanese invasion of Nanking of 1937 and so-called Nanking Massacre. Most Japanese believe that the Nanking Massacre is a gross exaggeration of the history. China's original claims of civilian victims were about 10,000, but the number has increased today to 300,000. So this is a gross exaggeration of the history in that sense. Because the population of Nanking was not 300,000 then, much, much smaller than that. The military parade, which took place in the Tiananmen Square on September 3rd last year, was another indication of China's strategy to downgrade Japan in the international community. President Xi Jinping made a fiery speech glorifying China's victory over fascist Japan's wartime conducts. To us Japanese, it was a strange perception of history on the part of President Xi. Japan never surrendered to Chinese communists. Japan surrendered to Kuomintang and the United States. The United States had a huge naval and air power and atomic bombs, to which Japan surrendered. Therefore, President Xi Jinping should have invited Kuomintang leaders and the United States leaders on the September 3rd. That's how we would tend to look at. And in fact, if the Chinese criticize Japan distorting or revising a history of Japan, history of World War II, we also argue that China, that is also distorting history. Japanese-Chinese relations, political relations, will not improve, therefore, until China seizes the use of history or history issue and stops anti-Japanese education. If you go to China and then turn on TVs, every day you see war films, Japanese war films, which is unfortunate. I would like to see that kind of activities to be stopped if we want to improve the relations between the two countries. Differences on history should not be a diplomatic issue. They can be debated by scholars, but not by the governments. Japan and China have a different political system. Japan elects political leaders by popular vote, whereas China practices no election. Chinese leaders face no public accountability. If Chinese citizens have say over the government policy, Chinese foreign and internal policies be quite different. Some citizens may demand that the government turn away from history issues and build a stronger foundation for Sino-Japanese relations. I feel this when I see many Chinese tourists who come to Japan and return home with a good impression of Japan, quite different from what the government has been telling them about Japan. Finally, I would like to say that there are many important areas where the two countries can share national concerns: climate change, air pollution, infectious disease, food safety, natural disaster such as earthquake and flood, and nuclear power plant safety, and many others. Scholars can study together how to tackle with these challenges. Academic cooperation, culture exchange, and tourism are vital means to improve our relations. We should, as Professor Jia mentioned, we should manage our difficult relations. We hope we can come to this stage. It will be a long time, but we must continue to try. I have brought some slides, only about less than 10. So I'd like to show you a little bit how tense our relations were. And also today it's easing, as Professor Jia mentioned, but still there is a great concern on our part about Senkaku. Let me see. I hope I can answer. Those who may not be quite familiar with where the Senkaku is, because I have talked to some of the Southeast Asian scholars. They said, we are trying to find what the Senkaku or Diary Island on the map. We couldn't find it. So this is where it is. Closer to Taiwan, closer to Chinese island, but also closer to the southern archipelago of Japan. These are the islands. They consist of about 7 islands. These are the more typically shown in public pictures. United States used one of the islands for shooting practices until '72. But again, during that time, Chinese did not complain about this at all. This is the picture of 1920s, where about 200 Japanese lived on the islands for the factory of what we call katsubushi. It's a bony island of fish, bonito, dried fish factories. This is the 2010 when the Chinese fishing boats bumped into Japanese Coast Guard because we tried to restrain the activities by the Chinese fishing boats. And as a result, the captain of this fishing boat was arrested by the Japanese side, and that created a huge uproar on the Chinese part because to arrest a fisherman in the area which they claim to be part of China. This is against of course, the national law. Therefore, they created a huge uproar and then became a big diplomatic issue in 2010. Japan released the fishermen under the pressure of Chinese government. Now, This is the 2013. China installed the ADIZ. As you see here, should I show this or should I this? Anyway, you can see the overlapping of ADIZ between Japan and China, and also Senkaku is included in the China's ADIZ, and this is also another source of tension between the two countries. This is the graph. You can't see small letters, but anyway, you can see the big jump of Chinese airplanes being scrambled by Japanese Air Force. After 2012, the number of frequency of or number of the Chinese aircraft jumped up, and this shows the seriousness between the two countries. Now it's small relations between. I mean the number this shows going down, but actually still about 400. This doesn't show it, but about 400 times the Japanese Air Force scrambled the Chinese airplanes approaching the space. Now, this is it. I just wanted to show you some of the areas of tensions between the two countries. Thank you very much.